So, hey, hey everyone, thanks for attending. Thank you, Ellie, so much for the invitation, the opportunity. So I'm going to be talking about the roles of dead and dying trees in forest ecosystems. My name is Manuel Anderson. I'm an ecologist, a research assistant with Michigan Natural Features Inventory, or MNFI. And I've been with MNFI for 2 years now. I'm going into my third season. And with MNFI, I do a lot of vegetation mapping. So a lot of my photos in this slide are from all my adventures in state parks and all my mapping, my time in the woods, essentially. So really, I was telling Ellie this is a good excuse to share a lot of cool mushroom pictures that would otherwise not see the light of day. And yeah, I also kind of have some experience in forest health and for my master's thesis in tree dieback, and some experience doing like plant monitoring and vegetation monitoring. So this was a lot of fun to put together, and hopefully I can transmit some of that fun and interest. Okay, let's get going. Of course, it's not. All right. So I kind of have two major parts, and then a third kind of add-on part. Talk about some of the ecological processes involved in diseased and dying trees, including nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, and then forest structure and process. And then the second part, I'm going to kind of do like a creature feature part where I'll just highlight some of the really cool organisms that really depend on coarse woody debris. And I'll focus especially on some of the rare organisms in the state. Because at Michigan Natural Features Inventory, that's kind of our wheelhouse. We're really focused on monitoring and maintaining a database of our most vulnerable and rare organisms. And then finally, I'll touch on this other project that we have that's using stumps and live trees to reconstruct fire history in parts of the state. That's a really cool project we have in collaboration with Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians and other university partners. So before we start, I wanted to talk about this caveat. Mostly, I'm going to be referring to kind of disturbance, disease, and tree death that's a result of natural processes. And what I mean by that is essentially processes that would be operating or are operating in a way that they were prior to European colonization and settlement. So kind of not referring to unnatural disturbance, which is the word we use to talk about post-colonial, like modern anthropogenic disturbance. And so, for example, this image shows it was a southern hardwood or a northern hardwood swamp, sorry, an ash swamp that has been decimated by emerald ash borer. And so now we have all these standing dead trees. And so while there might certainly be organisms that benefit from this kind of sudden mass death, that's not necessarily what I'll be talking about. And then, of course, and that's partly because these different kinds of disturbances have set up really different environmental conditions. We live in a world now where, because of modern anthropogenic disturbances, we have different species matrices, different species present, non-natives, introduced species. And like these disturbances look very different than they would have historically. Yeah, just a little note. And then another caveat is that this is a really complicated topic. Even as I was researching this, it was hard for me to find ways to present these topics in a list that made sense, just because there's so much interconnectedness. And this is just a little drawing of it as I was preparing the talk, of how all these things are connected. Not publication ready, so don't look at it too closely. But yeah, it's tricky. And so there's like lots of ways you can map out these connections and thinking through how things are related, and all these relationships are bilateral or multilateral. Very rarely are they unidirectional. So super cool ecology. And then I also wanted to bring in this spiral, decline spiral concept, or tree declines concept from Manuel. Maybe some of you may have seen it. Ellie and I were talking about this just before. And it's a good way to visualize first of all, how complicated tree decline and death can be. It's rarely just one thing. And second, kind of see the different layers and how that decline might progress. So in the outside of the spiral, you have predisposing factors, which are typically pre-existing conditions, essentially, where that tree is growing, its genetics, things that are already there from the beginning, from the inception of that tree's life. And then you have inciting factors, which might be a defoliation event, it might be damage, it might be a drought, severe drought. That might further predispose a tree to decline due to some kind of, or due to a hit to its resources, a significant stressor, essentially. And then you have contributing factors, which are these opportunistic, often biotic elements like further defoliation. It could be bark beetles, kind of other infections. It could be fungi that come in and further contribute to the decline and eventual death of a tree. And so we will kind of look at some of these biotic factors as a part of the picture of how dying and dead trees are related to everything else and how they function in forest ecosystems. And touch on how genetics are also involved in that a little bit. But yeah, you have, in terms of the roles of dead and dying trees, you have on both sides of the equation kind of organisms that can contribute and incite decline in disease and death. And then also on the flip side, organisms that benefit from the tree disease and death. So at a very kind of simple, not simple, but kind of obvious or not forward-facing perspective, I think when a tree dies in a forest, it opens up space. So you can see from this picture, these red pine are declining. Some of them are dead, some of them are dying. And so you have this sudden change in the canopy, you have light availability, you have space for new plants. And this can look pretty different depending on what system you're in. What does this look like? What does this mean? So if you imagine like a sugar maple forest or a late successional hemlock forest, where the primary disturbance agent is canopy gaps, gap phase dynamics. So single trees or groups of trees dying or blowing over, creating space. That can look like the perpetuation of that dominant species, like hemlock or sugar maple. And so in those systems, kind of assuming there's not too many deer, you have advanced regeneration or seedlings and saplings in the subcanopy, ready for a gap to happen. And then once a canopy tree dies or falls, they have their chance to shoot up to the canopy and kind of perpetuate that species, that forest, or like that dominance. And so that is really important if we're thinking about environmental change and adaptation for a population. That allows for genetic renewal and for genetic variability. So if you imagine a forest of trees that never die and the environment changes, very few of those might be able to cope. Whereas if there's this constant process of a mosaic of renewal, you have these new genetics being introduced, these selective pressures operating on those saplings as environmental factors change. And so you have this capacity to adapt for that population, and a forest resilience over the long term. Whereas maybe in a pine forest, such as this one, maybe in the absence of fire, which I think was the case here, you might not necessarily have further pine. That might be a transition into a different system, a more mesic system with maple or with balsam fir, depending, which is depending on our goals, maybe not so great, but is also a part of ecosystem change. Transitions happen depending on what disturbances happen or don't. And then in these gaps, they're really like these hotspots of biodiversity. They provide lots of different conditions in terms of light, moisture, temperature, which different plant species, animal species, fungi, all kinds of things can use. And you can imagine how, for example, in a gap, maybe you get some raspberry in there. You have all these flowers, floral resources for pollinators, fruits eventually for different animals. And so you really have these sites that they're relatively small if you're talking about a big forest, but they really add to the biodiversity and to the just structural diversity of the system. If you think of it as like a fabric. And it's really cool is that wood decay elements, so kind of anything that's related to dead wood, logs, stumps, branches. Some cases people also use talking about litter, which we're not really talking about. But all of those are actually really highly linked to overall biodiversity of a system. And then there's a study I read while putting this together that actually that was a better predictive factor, like the quality and quantity of coarse woody debris in a forest was a better explanatory variable for diversity than the age of a stand. So you can have second growth forests where all the coarse woody debris was taken out that are very low diversity compared to second growth forests that maybe were logged in the winter when snow was high. So you retained that microtopography, that coarse woody debris, and that lends to the overall diversity of the system. So you can kind of see that at different scales. I just threw in these photos of the swamp where probably all these trees died from a high water event. And so you can kind of see just how much structural diversity that is adding to that landscape. I'll think of all the different critters and organisms that can use that wood, perch in that wood on the snags, or grow within the woody tissue. And kind of on the small scale, you see that with mosses, lichens, algae, mushrooms, and understory plants as well. And when we think of these coarse woody or the wood decay elements, coarse woody debris, I'll kind of probably use those interchangeably. They're really an essential component of a function forest ecosystem. A lot of really important central processes wouldn't happen nearly as much without kind of a natural turnover and the presence of this coarse woody debris, both as standing kind of vertical structure and also horizontal on the ground wood. So an example of that is moisture. So one study found that during a drought, a coarse, like a log or decaying log had 25 times more moisture compared to surrounding soil. And so you can imagine that can be extremely important for different microbes, especially fungi, for tree seedlings and saplings as they grow. And this coarse woody debris functions as refugia, or kind of reservoirs of moisture, especially in dry spells. That's important, or in midsummer. They're really these hotspots of microbial and fungal activity. And that overall lends to forest resilience. So in a drought, you have these reservoirs of moisture, of activity, of diversity. In a fire, for example, those will be more resilient, won't burn as easily, and so you'll maintain that diversity that can then recolonize areas that were burned more hotly. And you can see this is a picture from Tuquamanon Falls State Park. There's some really gorgeous hemlock forests there, super incredible 400-year-old trees, probably older. And so that was probably like a 40-inch hemlock that had snapped. And so it's really spectacular to go and see these really massive trees and see that kind of old growth turnover in person. So furthermore, coarse woody debris can serve as substrate, a diverse kind of lots of different kinds of substrate depending on the species of the wood, and then also how decayed it is, where it's decaying. So there's lots of studies that show how these are really important for seedlings of trees, shrubs, and herbs, and specific species also. So there are certain plant species that are really quite conservative and loyal to this kind of microhabitat that's created by coarse woody debris. Mycorrhizae also, so mycorrhizae, I'm sure many of you do know, and they're basically fungal species that form associations with plants. So they're facilitating each other in that the tree is exuding extra carbohydrates and sugars from photosynthesis, which the fungus can use. In return, the fungus provides further surface area for the roots of a tree or a plant, and can provide more water, access to water, and more access to the nutrients as well. And so mycorrhizae, all kinds of fungi grow in coarse woody debris. And what's also really interesting is that different fungi will grow in different species of wood, but also in different sizes of wood. And so if you're trying to do a fungal survey and figure out what species you have in an area, you really need to be looking at all different classes of woody debris on the forest floor, from like small twigs and branches and leaf litter to the largest logs, because you'll find very different fungi there. And within those nursery substrates provided by logs and coarse woody debris, the mycorrhizae are facilitating tree growth or plant growth. And there's this one study, Zach 1971, who found that these fungi are blocking, in some cases, pathogens like pathogenic bacteria that might otherwise infect the trees. Mosses are a big one. There are many mosses that really are quite specific to the kinds of substrate they grow on. And so woody material is a really great substrate for a lot of different mosses. Lots of different microbes as well. And then beyond what grows on and within the coarse woody debris, kind of piles or logs have direct sheltering effects to areas beside them, especially or under them, for example. And those can be really good areas for trees to grow as well, for seedlings to establish and grow. So especially in the study, Akron 17, found that north of piles of wood, you'd have these like moister, cooler conditions in which trees would do really well. So here's some really nice mossy pictures. You can see how kind of on the far right, you have all these mosses, and probably algae that are pretty much only growing right on that decaying cedar. You have these mossy stumps where you kind of have like a hotspot of mosses and lichens. And of course, this large picture, you have this giant hollow. Like you can imagine what kind of critters might be happy to use or hang out in there, in addition to all the moss habitat. That looks like some boreal forests, probably feather mosses, pleurozium. But yeah. And then again, talking about nursery trees, nursery stumps, like these wood decay elements as microhabitat for seedlings. On the far left, you have yellow birch growing on this old stump with those crazy stilt roots. Yellow birch is a species really well known to compete well in these kinds of microhabitats, and you'll see them often. I mean, there's been areas I've been in where I only see yellow birch saplings on tibble mounds. So it really is a species that's dependent on these small scale gap dynamics and on these on the microtypography that's created by that. And so it's a species also that's really underrepresented now compared to historically, after everything was essentially clear cut in Michigan. In the center is a white spruce, which is not one I see a ton do this, but that's cool. And then on the right is a hemlock, which also is known to enjoy the refugia of stumps and logs. And here you can see a really old nursery log. This is in a boreal forest in the Keweenaw. But you can see this row of balsam fir growing on what was once a log, and now it's kind of just a mound in the forest. But it's really neat. You can kind of see these dynamics decades after they were initiated. Okay, so now to talk about soils. Wood decay is really central to soil productivity, which has all kinds of impacts on ecosystem health, on tree growth, right? In turn, it's all this cyclical. The wood itself interestingly doesn't actually have that much nitrogen, but once it's down on the ground and it starts to decay, it's colonized by all these free living nitrogen fixing bacteria who just get to fixing all this atmospheric nitrogen as they do their thing, and then this wood and all these wood elements essentially become like nitrogen pumps in the forest and these hotspots of nitrogen, while they're also really robust pools of nutrients. Other microbes like fungi and also plant roots and insects are busy kind of doing their thing, eating wood, decaying the wood, and everything in the wood to mineralize nutrients, essentially mineralize in a way that means convert to a form that's usable by lots of different organisms. And that can also, what's the word? kind of like stay in a stable spot and like stay there in that system. Wood can also, well, kind of this is related to the moisture thing. It has really high porosity, and so it retains a lot of moisture and then helps soil and structuring soils, and that wood can also be very persistent in the soils. You can find fragments in forest soils that are hundreds or even like 1,000 years old. So that those benefits kind of persist for really long term. And when there have been studies that have investigated what the impacts of removing this woody debris, like after like really intense forestry, or kind of at the turn of the century when so much was taken out of the forest. It really has these pretty deleterious, or can have pretty deleterious effects on like soil fertility, on moisture retention. It can lead to greater soil compaction. And so really allowing as much woody debris as possible to remain on the landscape allows for a lot of these processes to continue to support soil health for decades, centuries, and millennia. Also, of course, carbon is stored in trees. And so as a forest ages, all this carbon becomes locked into trees and locked into wood, and a lot of that is released as it decays, but a lot of it is also stored and integrated into the soils. And there's actually a paper, I put this really nice mossy log, mossy cedar in a peatland that showed how mosses specifically can be really instrumental in locking away that carbon as they colonize woody surfaces, woody debris, especially after kind of larger scale events. They can help build those soils directly over wood and store that carbon long term. As it's buried deeper and deeper, you have less wood decay happening. It's more anoxic, like not as much oxygen, so that wood will stay more stable, or sorry, the carbon will stay in the soils in that wood formed for longer. And this is a figure just from one of my classes with Andrew Burton at Michigan Tech when we were looking at ecosystem processes. Just really quick, GPP, the very top line, is gross primary productivity. So it's all the carbon in that system that's being assimilated, all the sunlight, all the energy, how much carbon is being stored from that or like fixed. And then you can see as a forest ages, it kind of plateaus after about 150 years, that primary productivity. And at the same time, you have the RA and the RH lines are respiration. So it's like decay happening, carbon being released back into the atmosphere. That increases as the system ages to a point where, in this paper at least, about 400 years on after a major disturbance, you get to a kind of stable state where respiration equals carbon fixation from photosynthesis. But it takes time. It takes a long time to happen. And actually, this shows it decreasing to zero, and that might be the case in some cases, but it's kind of a debated topic. Ostensibly, forests continue to store carbon even a little bit as they continue to exist. Okay, that's that. For this second part, sorry, I feel like I talked a lot. We're going to do the creature features, starting with plants and fungi real quick. So we talked a lot about this already, right? So of course, woody debris is really important for providing different microtopography, or different substrate availability. As trees die, that creates new light conditions, moisture conditions, temperature conditions, which allows different kinds of plants and seedlings to colonize and grow, and mosses as well. And you have certain species that are really loyal to these kinds of disturbance conditions, from canopy disturbance conditions, which often, as I mentioned earlier, provide different kinds of, and really lots, like quite dense floral and fruit resources for other organisms. There's just a couple cute examples of some sundews on the right in a fen that was like that were posted up on this dead tree. And this is probably a dicranum, like a broom moss on a little twig, little hairdo. Fungi, also, I think we talked lots about, but there's there are fungi that are parasites, so they attack living trees, and then there are fungi that are saprotrophs that um, feed on dead matter. Essentially, that's what that means. And so both are involved in these systems or these processes of tree disease and death, and are essential to what we talked about, carbon and nutrient cycling, and facilitation of plant growth through mycorrhizal associations. Um, yeah, these are kind of, I think we touched on these points. Here's one of my colleague Abe Stone, who's a botanist at MNFI with a Latoporus, chicken of the woods, one of our probably most well-known charismatic edible mushrooms. And this is a cool one because it's both weakly parasitic and saprotrophic. So it'll colonize wounds on living trees and contribute to tree decline, but will also continue persist and feed off of necrotic or dead tissue even after the tree dies. So these can be really, I've seen full trees colonized, probably pounds and pounds of mushrooms on a single tree. This is another wood decayer or saprotroph, Foliota. This is really one of my favorite mushrooms. They're like really cool. I think I have another picture. Another wood decayer, coral tip mushroom, or crown tip coral, which is also edible, apparently. They was telling me this the other day. Really beautiful. So you can imagine without this log, if we took out all this dead debris, we wouldn't have these spectacular organisms to enjoy also. So here's some more Foliota on the left, wood decay or saprotrophs, jelly mushrooms, another edible, really beautiful fungus. And I think these are actually potentially slime molds in the middle. And of course, fungi have been used for millennia as food, as medicine, as tools. We have birch polypores here on the left, which is another parasitic mushroom used medicinally, I think, like as an anti-parasite. You have Ganoderma in the middle, that's hemlock varnish mushroom, which is a saprotroph. And then, of course, chaga on the far right, which is parasitic and used medicinally on birch. Okay, now into the creatures. So you have all kinds of insects, invertebrates, mollusks that depend on dead and dying trees. So you have xylophages, which are wood eaters. They'll eat live trees or dead trees. Defoliators, of course, they're eating leaf tissues. Xylem and phloem suckers, like things like scale and aphids, will feed off of trees, contributing often already weakened trees, right? Contributing to that decline spiral. So these are causal or opportunistic agents that are participating in these systems and cycles. You have saproxylophages, which are wood eaters specifically of dead wood material. And then you have springtails or columbella. So they're not insects, they're a different order and are really vital in like biotech. They aren't necessarily eating dead woody material, but are causing bioturbation or doing bioturbation, essentially like mixing up matter and kind of introducing oxygen, and considered pretty central to like soil development. And then, of course, all these insects that depend, all these invertebrates that depend on, of course, woody debris are food sources for all kinds of other invertebrates, things like centipedes, which are like insect carnivores, and often will live amongst coarse woody debris, hunting other insects. You have mammals, birds, all kinds of things that really depend on the insects that live on dead trees. And now, so I was telling Ellie earlier, I basically chose some of these rare organisms based on how cute I thought they were, how interesting. This is a native slug, which I didn't know we had in Michigan until I was doing this research. Phylomycus carolinianus, the Carolina Mandel slug. So it's considered imperiled in the state and really highly dependent on down coarse woody debris. Because of course they need lots of moisture. If they dry out, they'll die. And so you'll find them in pretty high quality forests, mesic forests, especially, or dry mesic forests, under moist bark, on within kind of amongst coarse woody debris. They also have very low dispersal because they're so restricted by their habitat to these microsites. It's kind of where their eggs and babies stay. And so they're very vulnerable to kind of some forms of harvest or to forest fire, very intense forest fires. They also consume fungi, lichens, algae. And yeah, I saw this study. It was funny. They like gave 50 different species of fungus to this slug and they ate all of them. It was like happy to eat any mushroom, but barely ate any kind of leafy material, only romaine lettuce. So it was like the only green it liked. But yeah, I never thought I'd say a slug was cute, but I think these are adorable. And I hope you think so too. So this is another protected or listed insect, Bryobius sexnotatus, expanded longhorn beetle. It's a wood borer. This one's considered critically imperiled in Michigan. It's listed as state threatened. And so the larvae feed on large and old elm, maple, beech, also basswood. And so the adults will lay their eggs on these mature trees, and those larvae will continue to feed until after the tree dies. So they'll continue. They're kind of part of that, right? Opportunistic decline spiral on a living tree, and then they'll also continue to use and depend on the dead tree tissues. It's a really beautiful beetle. So herpetiles, we're talking about amphibians, reptiles, turtles. Also really across the board, pretty reliant on coarse woody debris and downed wood. They use it for shelter, foraging. Like here we have, I think there's a garter snake in a forest amongst some dead birch. They'll use logs as basking spots. You can think of turtles in ponds. They'll bask and thermoregulate, or snakes will go under logs to cool down on a sunny day. Also for moisture, especially thinking about amphibians, they need that coarse woody debris as moisture refugia. They'll nest or ovodeposit under or within logs and coarse woody debris, or use this debris to hibernate too. So our example, I'm just kind of talking about salamanders in general. I think we all know and love salamanders. We have a dozen species in Michigan. It's half of those are listed, so it's kind of crazy. And they're really dependent on down logs as shelter, especially when they're looking for, they're kind of in the growing season, when they're foraging, they're straying from their ponds once they're adults, or looking for mates. And then they also, within the vernal pools or wetlands, they'll use the woody debris to lay their eggs and to shelter. And also when they're in their larval, or what's the word? When they're swimming before they develop in legs, they're using those as shelter. So this one on the right is a marbled salamander. And then another example, eastern fox snake, considered imperiled in Michigan, also uses kind of a lot of what I mentioned for reptiles in general. We'll use woody debris for cover, thermoregulation. We'll deposit eggs under logs and in brush. And that's a really, really neat snake, really gorgeous. Birds in general, also, we can all think of ways in which they've used woody debris, building nests. So here, this picture is a picture of a bald eagle nest on Hog Island in the Beaver Island archipelago. And I was reading that these nests can weigh 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. So it's like a lot of wood that they're collecting, and they're perennial. So they'll kind of return to the same nest year after year and continue adding to it. They use dead trees for forage, for insects, for other food, as perches from which to hunt or from which to observe. They use them to roost. And then also, of course, like owls, especially, we think of woodpeckers will create or use previously created cavities in dead trees. So it's primary cavity makers, such as woodpeckers, and secondary cavity makers will use those created cavities. And so, of course, classic example, the bald eagle, our charismatic national bird, Um, it is one of those that's really rebounded since it was originally listed. It's done really well. In Michigan, it's now considered apparently secure, so ranked as 4, but it's still listed as special concern. And you're even in this image, you can see how it's posted up on this eagle is posted up on a dead branch, kind of observing. And of course, when a branch is dead or a tree is dead, you don't have all the foliage obscuring your vision. So they're important spots from which to hunt, from which to kind of watch out what's happening. And they use dead trees especially to roost when they're migrating. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, for nesting sites and for material. Here's another black-backed woodpecker is considered imperiled in the state. This one is really dependent on, classically, like historically, on disturbance or large swaths of dead trees caused by fire, especially coniferous forests. And so, of course, we don't have a lot of fire. We don't really have a lot of these large-scale tree mortality events the same way we might have once. So yeah, that's part of why we've observed their decline. And so they will forage in these coniferous forests after large disturbances for insects, for food that will colonize these dead and dying trees. And they also create their nests in trees and dead trees, and those wood chips that they create they use as bedding. They'll kind of keep that at the very bottom of the cavities. And they create a new cavity every year. So those are now kind of other cavities or other habitat for other animals that can use those as secondary nesting spots. So that's really cool. It's one I wonder, for example, with the ice storm that happened, if that's a species that might be benefiting from that event up north, potentially. And then mammals. Well, we have this little mammal in this large oak on Beaver Island. That's Derek Hartline from Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa, the Natural Resource Department there. So we were all out there doing some survey work. We found this really cool tree to hibernate in. And so yeah, lots of mammals use coarse woody debris and cavities as shelter. The black bears will den up in a big old tree, or forage for insects that have colonized dead trees. Small mammals will use coarse woody debris as travel corridors on the forest floor. And then they also consume a lot, like I mentioned the insects, but they'll also consume fungi and in turn spread the spores. They'll spread kind of through their activity and through eating and pooping, will actually spread the nitrogen fixing bacteria that are so important to the nitrogen cycle in forests. And so here is also another really cute guy, the smoky shrew, another one I didn't know about until I was reading for this presentation. So it's considered critically imperiled in Michigan, but it's only a special concern currently. It's only known from a single county in Chippewa County in the East UP. And these require coarse downed woody debris for cover, for foraging. They'll nest in coarse woody debris and logs or in stumps. And they, of course, most of what they're eating is dependent on the existence of this wood decay on the forest floor. And I wonder if that's a shrew. So I know that's a picture from Michigan. So I wonder if that's eating it looks like a lumbersid, which are actually not native to Michigan. It's kind of doing a dual purpose. And bats also, of course, another really classic group of animals that historically have really depended on coarse woody debris, especially vertical snags, vertical habitat. They'll nest under kind of slowing bark or bark that's kind of peeling off, or within trees and cavities and hollow trees. We have 9 species in Michigan, and 5 of those are listed. And of course, we've had they've been really severely affected by white nose syndrome, and some species have declined by 95 to 99%. So yeah, they're really sensitive. We should be doing our best to provide as much habitat as we can for them. And I will plug, actually, there was a really great webinar that Michigan Wetlands Association hosted that had, I think her name was maybe Jenny Wong from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who gave a talk on bats. That was really, really great. And I recommend that for anyone that was interested in knowing more. Okay, and really finally, with just a few minutes left, I'm going to talk about this project that that MNFI, specifically Josh Cohen, who's our lead ecologist, initiated with folks at Little Traverse Bay, Bands of Odawa, tribe up there, and with here we are with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also researchers at Michigan State and University of Minnesota. And the project is called Setting the Straits on Fire. And so it's using, we've been looking at how stumps that are still present on the landscape, they're really old stumps from when, or that were growing and were cut during the cutover 100, 120 years ago, are still present on the landscape. And we're looking at how these stumps and the growth of the rings can tell stories about the fire histories of the region, stories of how people have been using the lands, specifically the tribal lands on the reservation in Northwest Michigan, and what that can tell us about the landscape. So these coarse woody debris elements, these stumps, are kind of these living or dead documents that, paired with living trees, we can use to kind of construct chronologies of disturbance and cultural history in these areas. So it's been a really awesome project. I've been just tangentially related or involved, but it's really, really incredible. And so here's some images of some of these stumps, and you can see how, well, old fire scars and how that tissue grew over those fire scars, and then eventually these trees die. Sometimes you'll find living trees with these scars too. And so the idea is to match, run dendrochronology, or how these tree rings, what these tree rings can tell us about the histories of these places, and kind of construct that fire history by matching and layering the tree growth rings. And so at this site in Wilderness State Park, they have essentially mapped this timeline back to 1650. It was some of the earliest fires they recorded, 1653. So nearly 400 years of reconstructed history through this project. And these are just as an example, just all these fires that were recorded at this one site at Spirit Lake in Wilderness State Park, with a fire return interval of 6 years. And yeah, I guess that's it. That's that. I wanted a lot of the work I do, of course, is supported a lot of times by the DNR. We work with folks at LTVB. Derek Hartline, Bill Parsons, Kip Mueller are specifically all involved in that project, the Setting the Straits on Fire. And of course, at MNFI, it's an incredible team. These are just some of the many folks that I've worked with for the projects I've been most involved in, but it's a big team of 35-ish people: botanists, zoologists, ecologists, GIS experts, administrators, and yeah, I just wanted to shout out to them. And not pictured Abraham Stone, who knows a lot more about mushrooms than me. And here's some references in case you're interested. Yeah, I think that's it.